Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, thanks to everybody. Very pleased to be here with a fascinating series of lectures. And, well, I suppose from your point of view, here comes another one. Now, I have the controls, and I had a title. There we are. I'm going to talk in 4 chapters on this one, because my subjects and my interests are historical geography. We'll be going back to the 1800s, sealers, 1900s, whalers, and we'll get into the 2000s with a modern aspect. The first 2 were local livelihoods in the Antarctic rather than Antarctica. I slightly changed the title because it is the Southern Ocean where this took place. And in a sense, if you look at history in the Antarctic, you can get stages of exploration which work this way. Those in greater color are the ones I'll deal particularly with. Terra Australis was theoretical. The real knowledge of the shape of the continent came with Cook and Bellingshausen. A sealing period, over 1,400 voyages in that time. The heroic period, continental penetration, exploration of the interior of the continent. Then the Southern Ocean was the whalers' sea. Permanent stations, treaty period, and the most recent use, human resources, are fisheries. But 4 chapters, the early sealing, the 1800s. Now, you have here the continent, and around it, you'll see a series of islands. There's actually 19 of them. I'll use the term peri-Antarctic islands. Shackleton regarded South Georgia, at least, as the gateway to the Antarctic. So much of these industries were based on these islands, and interesting points here, many are beyond the limits of the Antarctic Treaty. And you can see the dotted line, which is the Antarctic convergence, or the polar front, which separates the Southern Ocean from the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans. Now, the earliest days, Captain Cook and Fabian Bellingshausen, the voyages they made. Cook penetrated the Antarctic Circle on 3 occasions. Interestingly, in the 3 places, that went further south, so he really found nothing of the continent. Bellingshausen made 6 penetrations of the way south, and near the 0 meridian was the first sighting of the ice, the first sighting of the continent, which is an interesting story. But apart from that, Cook found South Georgia, South Sandwich Islands. Bellingshausen also saw Macquarie Island, South Shetland Islands, and several of the peri-Antarctic islands came to appear on the map. Indeed, this is a list of them. I can give you a copy of this. There's no need to take this lecture note, but the years of discovery, the years of the first landing, and the first sealers. Look where I've marked it in red. So much of the knowledge of the Antarctic and discoveries came from this. At the beginning, it was over-exploitative, but there's a better story of this later. The time from the sealers, a less estimated part of Antarctic history. There were 2 species they took. The first was the fur seal, more money to be made for it. The demand for pelts throughout much of the world, including particularly the Far East, had these animals very well adapted to the Antarctic climate, with very dense fur. The products were leather and fur from them, shallow divers and krill eaters. The elephant seal, that was blubber, different insulation, deep diver, takes fish and squid. And the product was basically seal oil, equivalent to whale oil, until indeed petroleum oils were developed in the latter part of the 1800s. Then for food, fuel, all sorts of industrial processes, whale oil and elephant seal oil were major factors. The sealing, fascinating thing, a vast amount of Antarctic history involved in it, but so little. There's very little written. Here we have James Weddell with his ships, Jane and Beaufoy. The Weddell Sea and the Weddell Seal are named after him. He was one of the few literate sealers, 1,490 voyages and about a dozen books if you're broad-minded and 24 other papers. It's a lot of detective work to find out where they went, what they did, and what happened in that period. South Georgia, an island where I made a couple of winters. That was a major sealing headquarters, as with Kerguelen, Macquarie Island, and some of the others. But if you look at the coast, you might think Norway here, all the fjords, and these places where the fur seals and later the elephant seals could accumulate in numbers, and with the resources of the Southern Ocean around it. I'm going to mention South Georgia in another context in the next chapter. The sealers. Exploration was part of their story. They were finding new areas. They had one concept that was wrong. They were taking seals at such a rate that some of the islands almost lost their population. And the sealers were fooling themselves. They didn't realize they'd exterminated seals in some places. They said they had migrated elsewhere. So the sealers were always looking for new islands and trying to make discoveries. That's a sealer's map of South Georgia. Quite recognizable. Many of the place names are still around and have survived to modern maps. The tripods they used for boiling the elephant blubber. This is the beginning of the South Georgia Whaling Museum. Nigel Bonner, a biologist, and there's the staff of the museum. And if you rub carbon paper on the sides of the old pots, you'll find they were made by Johnson & Son, Wapping Dock, London. So many of these islands, at least half of them, have these old tripods from the elephant sealers. The first sealers left very little. The main thing they left behind was pegs for setting the skins over the beaches to dry. Kerguelen, another one of the peri-Antarctic islands. Here you can see the part the sealers have mapped. On this side is considerable detail. This part was far rockier, far fewer seals, and far less interest, so it doesn't really appear on the map very well. Sealers still remain, too. The history. Kerguelen at Betsy Cove had a series of graves that, this is the Challenger expedition in the 1870s, were still legible. But the remains of these activities, what logbooks there were, some things like such remains on some of the islands, with a bit of detective work, allow you to get a bit of who went where, when with the sealers. Here's another example. Oil barrels, one of the last of the sealers on Heard Island, an Australian dependency south in the Indian Ocean. Rather bad weather, to say the least. Those were full of oil once. You can still see remains of seal oil in those, elephant seals. But some of the old hearths and remains are around. It must have been bad weather that caused that amount of quite profitable seal oil to be left. There's some exceptional things too. Mercator Cooper, aboard the ship Levant from Sag Harbor in the United States, in 1853, going south beyond the Bellini Islands, which he mapped, had a map and a detail. It looks as though he saw the coast of the South Continent. That's his writing from the logbook. And indeed, landings on the Antarctic. We've heard of Bellingshausen with the first sighting, but actually landing on it. We have good historical records of 5 sealers making the first landings. I thought I'd put this one in for a bit of amusement. I said there's very few books written on the sealing industry, but the fellow hasn't seen very many elephant seals from the look of that, but that's the fate of a sealer, one that at least did illustrate one of the very few books from this period. In a few places too, this is Macquarie Island, where seals were being boiled, the remains of the blubber, also taking penguins and boiling those for the blubber. You can find what might look like a geological stratum, but that's the bones from the old industry. There's material piled up above from storm, and there's the original territory, the soils of the island, and you can see there's burrowing birds been there. These little relics remain. There's another relic next to it. Second chapter. Once again, the exploitation of the resources of the Southern Ocean, human use of it. 1900s whaling. Here again, we have the peri-Antarctic islands, and those with arrows were major centers of whaling, with South Georgia, a total of 7 stations. I'll show you that in a moment. Again, biological resources of the Southern Ocean. When Sven Fein in Norway perfected the cannon and produced the whale catchers like this, that was the change from the old style of whaling throughout all the oceans, and the Arctic Ocean, plenty of whales there until overexploited, was something like this. The whale catcher was the clue to the modern industry as distinct from what I'll call the Moby Dick style of whaling. These deployed in the Southern Ocean. There's South Georgia again, and you can see there were 7 whaling stations around it. Those are in black in these bays, a little bit like Norwegian fjords. And Carl Anton Larsen was from Sandefjord. The beginning of the industry was Norsk. The 3 red names you can see are places which were scientific stations. Bird Island still going, King Edward Point, one where I was, and Royal Bay. That was a German station from the first International Polar Year. That was 1882-83. International Geophysical Year and other stations also operated in later polar years, but they were all at King Edward Point, the best harbour on the island. This massive industrial activity. You talk about pristine and untouched. The continent, yes, the land, but these stations, you can see here's Prince Olaf Harbour, and to use the whalers' term, on full cook. The boilers, coal-fired, boiling down the whales for blubber, and the government requirements from in those days it was Falkland Islands Dependencies government, required full carcass utilization. So meat and bone were also processed to reduce waste, although it was a difficult industry to say the least. You all know these photographs. This is from Leith Harbour, taken in 1908, and there's the factory behind it. Grytviken started in 1904, continued whaling until 1965, a small industrial settlement. You have all the processes for dealing with blubber, meat, bone, then the accommodation for all the persons aboard, and the ships, the whale catchers, going in and out of that island. Indeed, we're into the realms of colour photography. In some audiences, I have to give a warning of a bit of blood and guts. Here's a sperm whale on the plan in South Georgia. I believe that one is 1962. Now, overexploitation. There was the International Whaling Commission. That was to preserve the industry. In a sense, that might be to conserve the whale, but sadly it didn't work. This is Leith Harbour in South Georgia. Roughly, I'd say these are crow's nests on the whalers, 1, 2, 3, 4. I get about 19 of those whale catchers. It's an example of the overexploitation that led to the doom of the whaling industry, and the regulations which followed later and slowly. These days, around many areas, Antarctic Peninsula, South Shetland Islands, Deception Island, this one, South Georgia, Kerguelen, and other places, you can see quite astonishing little relics. But science was there also. The discovery expeditions. Here, we had whale marking to identify where they'd been shot, where they were picked up, to get an idea of their movements. The Norwegian side was important. Lars Christensen had a series of expeditions, and here you have 2 maps, 1927 of Antarctica and 1937 showing the results of 10 years' work. Interestingly, Norway is the only country with territory in the Arctic and Antarctic, and the reason is the whalers. Now, 1.5 million whales were taken then. We have fairly accurate statistics for that industry, that aspect of human activity in the Southern Ocean. Now, it's more fish. Well, krill, everything either eats a krill or eats something that eats krill in these circumstances. There they are, you've already seen one. And the indications on that map in colour are the main areas where krill is usually around in somewhat of an abundance. And humanity is going for krill as well as squid and fish. You've seen something like this, where we have, from this point of view, man as dominant, krill and other zooplankton in the center, and you can see almost everything is taking it, and over the years, human exploitation, with the old whaling and sealing, these are extinct, but plenty of lines are still active for human effects in that region. I think it's a little bit overrated. You need rather a lot of thick mayonnaise to be able to eat that stuff, but it was tried. Now, regulations. The sealing, hardly any regulations, the whaling inadequate, but the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources was formed in 1980. Estonia is a member through the European Union. And you can see the continent there, and the lines around it marking the areas which are designated, corresponding roughly to the Southern Ocean. Current Southern Ocean fishing fleets, you see the birds are all around them, are operating many, the vast majority, subject to the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. That's a terrible acronym. Now, the ugly one there is the ice fish. I know the colleague above it. This was a particularly expensive and sought-after fish with quite a few problems of overexploitation. And something, for instance, from the Chileno, Argentine, and British point of view, around the area between the southern part of Americas and Antarctica, was a major catching area for it. But the regulations are effectively working, but not perfect. Here we have an Australian warship off Heard Island. There are still patrols and regulations. There's what are called pirates. There's the irregular, the unreported, and a proportion of the catch is, let's say, unofficial to say the least. There's patrol ships from Falklands. Here's one from Australia. Near its waters, Argentina has them, and Chile has had similar problems. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the seals, more than a century since they were last exploited, they have now largely recovered. Populations are coming back. Fur seals are overabundant in South Georgia. Elephant seals, plenty of them. The whales, vastly depleted, slowly returning. Places like Shag Rocks, one hardly ever saw anything. Blue whales are regularly around there. They're back from the brink. 2 success stories. But let's look at these biodynamics. Here I have a histogram of all the sealing voyages. Remember the detective work where we went going through. We start in 1775 with Captain Cook and carry it on all the way through with a number of voyages. The discovery of the South Shetland Islands. Remember Bellingshausen met seals there. That was the gold rush for seals. And there's the numbers as one goes through. From most of the 1800s, the score 1490 is what I've got. Now look at the whaling. Here, it started in 1904, and commercial whaling was finishing here in the 1990s. Here we have the number of factories, whaling stations, and floating factory ships. But if we look at the number of whales, here we have the black line. You can see an interesting bit of history. The start, the different number of factories, the economic depression. First World War had a great increase. Second World War, there were problems with much of the whaling ships being the Norwegian ones taken by Germany. We have the highest catch of whales here in the 60s. Many previous records have given that as much earlier, but there was a paper in the Journal of the International Whaling Commission in about 1996, which actually gave the real catch from the Soviet expeditions that they've been underreporting by perhaps 90% in places. I think if he published that paper more recently, the author might still be in Siberia. But we have the correct figures on this. Now, how I like to interpret it. Here, 1775, Captain Cook. I've taken it to 2025. This is the old line on a blackboard style of teaching, ladies and gentlemen, as you'll see. Here we have 100%, 200, and down to 0. What probably happened with these over 2 centuries of human activity? One can look at the first seal. Taking everything to start at 100, you've got to start roughly there. That's Captain Cook. With the discovery of the South Shetland Islands and the massive slaughter of the fur seals, reduced to perhaps 10%. Then, as the sealers were looking for more islands, here we have Heard Island, Macquarie Island, here we have Heard Island, back to South Georgia. They were bouncing along the bottom, vastly depleted. The fur seal industry really gave up. The demand was down, the supply was similarly going down. And what records we have from biology is slowly bringing it up through the 1900s. And the evidence, for instance, on South Georgia seems to indicate they have overshot. Nature will restore the balances one way or another sooner or later. Elephant seals, there was nowhere near as much profit to be made from those, and there was more work to get the oil. So a similar thing, starting from Cook, a descent, but a slow rise. Nowhere near such damage to those as there was with the fur seals. Looking at the same thing, again, theory and practice, to get accurate data is difficult. The concept is very useful, however. The krill, your major predators. Fur seals took it directly. Elephant seals took squid and fish that eat it. So you have a rise of those. And coming down as the seal numbers return to normal, return to what they had been at Cook's time. Now, you have an abundance of krill. So a slow blue line rises with the whaling industry until 1904 when it started. The beginning of the crash, the war, economic depression, and way down till whales are reduced. Now, also back from the brink, they're being sighted in places where they hadn't been seen for years. They're in some of the local fjords of South Georgia. We can begin to see them slowly coming back. They're slow breeders. It takes time. And putting on top of this, you can begin to see the idea of what fisheries might do. Increased the abundance of krill, now decreasing and leveling out. Again, I can't be all that accurate with figures. This is a concept, and I haven't gone past 2025. So this is a little bit of the dynamics of the Southern Ocean. The exploitative periods and the local livelihoods. Those were the people working on the Southern Ocean in these periods. And any questions? Come on, you've got 2 minutes and 45 seconds. We look like being a little early for lunch.
How many books have you written already? You have worked with this subject so many years, have had so many lectures in the conferences and the board of the ships, tourist ships. So,
thank you very much for that question. I suppose with the subject we had, we could also include tourism and other human activities there, but let's keep this to biology and avoid ourselves as a mammal. But my major work with the historical, I started off with interest in biogeography. Then, as you can see, I got older and ended up with historical geography, looking at human effects on that region. So the chronology of exploration, that started in Scott Polar with Brown Roberts, but I've completed that, so that's getting on for 4,000 or 5,000 entries, including the sealers. To try to get them into it is a difficult bit, detective work. South Georgia, where I spent some time, there's a text I wrote at that, published shortly after I got out of prison as a result of events in 1982, and that's still in print. And most recently, relevant to the lecture I've just given, we had a seminar in Cambridge. It was 2016, sorry, I'm getting dates a bit lost, was on the sealing industry, where people, many parts of the world, including the southern hemisphere of Chile and Argentina, and those specializing in the north, dealt a lot with trying to untangle what had happened with the Antarctic sealing industry. Thank you.